Welcome to this special Their ABC interview. Joining me today is Richard Alston, who is a former Howard Government Cabinet Minister and Minister for Communications, a businessman, barrister, and somewhat of an expert on the ABC. He is an author of a new book, Their ABC, Australia's largest sheltered workshop. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Evan. Good to be here.
Richard, what do you think are the problems with the ABC in general, and what is wrong with the ABC?
Well, this concept of sheltered workshop derives from the notion of all-round protection. That used to be a very popular thing back in the Menzies era, but it's an outmoded concept, but it applies very much to the ABC because it is immune. It doesn't have to raise money. It can employ as many people as it likes. It doesn't have to respond to consumers. In other words, it's not fighting fit. It's got this huge moat around it, which enables it to do whatever it likes. And I suppose the most insidious thing about that is that most organisations are very responsive to their audiences, and if they have concerns, they address them. But here, the ABC can be criticised by a regulatory body or even by its own self-appointed investigative committees, and just completely ignores it. Or it argues against it. It'll say, no, we don't accept what the regulator says. And that's being totally non-responsive. And that's not what Australians expect. I mean, if you go back to 1946, when Richard Boyer was long-serving chairman, he said the role of the ABC was to inform and educate. It wasn't to proselytise. And he made that very clear, that they shouldn't be in there taking sides on arguments, but basically that's all they ever do.
What do you think we can do to fix the ABC? Is it making it more answerable to consumers? You're talking about it being a sheltered workshop. What is the answer to make it more responsive to everyday Australians who don't really notice it on their tax bill? Is it a subscription service? Is it privatisation? Is it more reform around the edges?
Look, the problem you always find is that whenever you want to make statutory changes, the opposition of the day in the Senate will block them. And that's always been the case. And the powers of the board are quite limited. For example, there is a staff-appointed director. Now, that's unheard of in the private sector. But what that does is it dampens board discussion. I mean, if you were sitting around that table and you had a criticism, let's privatise the ABC, for example, it'd be out there in a flash because the staff-appointed director is accountable to the staff and will keep them informed. So it's got all these sort of structural problems about it. Now, the first thing you could do is to try and make it more effectively accountable to its charter. Because the charter, like, you know, the Russian constitution, they used to say we're the most democratic country in the world. Look at our constitution. The ABC, if you read the charter, it all sounds pretty good. They've got to be objective and impartial. Well, part of the problem, and I discovered this when I researched it, was that there's an editorial guy in charge of editorial policies for about 6 years called Alan Sunderland, and he's still hanging around the place. But he had extraordinary views. He would say things like, well, you know, you don't always have to be honest. You could breach your charter if you had to, but it's all in the public interest. And more importantly, he said things like, well, fair and impartial is really just in the eye of the beholder. It's not an objective test. A journalist, in fact, would be abdicating responsibility if he put both sides of an issue. He's supposed to follow the weight of the evidence, which means if you're a climate change fanatic, that's all you ever get. And it applies to a whole range of issues because essentially there is this left-wing worldview that permeates the ABC, and you've got this lack of management control. So essentially the staff run the show, as Gerard Henderson is fond of saying, it's a staff collective. And there's no real accountability. I mean, some of their so-called star journalists have made complete fools of themselves in the last couple of years with the programs they put on. But there's never any discipline, there's no accountability. So I think tightening up the charter might be worth a try. And, you know, the Albanese government seems to be liberal light in many respects, and they may well be interested in accountability. Now they're there, different in opposition, you oppose everything on principle, but they might just take the view that enough's enough, because the ABC doesn't just criticise Liberals, it criticises anyone who's what they call right. And Labor is essentially right of the left, so you'll find they'll be quite keen to criticise the Labor Party on an ongoing basis. So I think there might be some prospect, I wouldn't be putting it too highly, but, you know, to try and fix those sorts of basic issues in a doable way, rather than saying, well, I've never believed in privatisation because I don't think it works, and I actually think a better performing ABC is what everyone wants, both sides of politics, what the consumers want. You know, free of ads is a fantastic thing if you can get away with it. And to me, that's one of the big issues. And, you know, we've tried appointing people to the board, but they all seem to be captured very quickly. You get the sense that ITA tries to do a few things behind the scenes, but again, you get captured, you know. They give you a private car, chauffeur-driven car, you get, you know, top air fares, you get beautiful accommodation. You're captured in 5 minutes. And of course you realise that if you did speak out, it'll be leaked and all of a sudden you'll be under the gun.
I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned about, you know, journalists and making all sorts of mistakes in the last few years. You know, a big scandal of journalism, I thought, was the reporting on the Christian Porter and Alan Tudge matters. How do you think that played out, and what effect did the ABC have? Because we've seen this before with things like the Pell case as well. How did the ABC putting that to air, how did that really resonate with the public interest at all?
Well, I think the public interest is in having balanced programs for a start, and of course the Pell thing was just a complete one-way pile-on. And one of the worst things about that was that Louise Milligan, who wrote a book or two about Pell, she wrote one after the event, after he'd been unanimously acquitted at the High Court. And she basically apologised for nothing. She said, you know, he shouldn't have been allowed to appeal. Basically, they got it wrong. And she just kept on writing that he was, you know, he committed all these horrible offences. And to me, that is a total lack of accountability. The ABC should have been telling her she was not to quarrel with High Court decisions. And yet they seem to be able to do whatever they like. And I think that's tragic. Some of those other programs that they've got wrong, the Porter case, they probably could have settled that quite cheaply, but Robert Gottliebson pointed this out. They have a huge in-house law team. They've got about 28 to 30 in-house lawyers, and they can spend whatever they like. They're prepared to spend potentially millions on Porter. And you ask, well, why? And eventually they said, oh, well, yes, we mightn't have been able to ever prove anything wrong, but we're entitled to report. Well, I don't think that's very responsible. The odd commercial might do that, and people would scream and yell and say, oh, you know, gutter press, but the ABC seems to be able to justify these things because they're not accountable.
And there was all sorts of issues with the program itself, that they had, you know, former university debating students, and they didn't disclose political allegiances to the Labor Party. They didn't disclose old relationships between Christian Porter and other people that were speaking out against him. It really was a shambles. And that kind of leads me to a point you raise in your book, that there are a certain group of untouchables, people that continue to get away with grave mistakes, like Louise Milligan, like Sally Neighbour, like, I would say, Laura Tingle as well, who accused the Prime Minister of ideological bastardry and didn't really even get a slap on the wrist. What do you think it is about these untouchables that enables them to keep getting away with all these mistakes?
Well, because there is this groupthink, and they don't have an allegiance to the ABC as such. They have an allegiance to themselves and their own worldview. So if the managing director stepped in and said to Laura Tingle, this is disgraceful, you can't say that sort of thing, the staff would go bananas, and she might resign, others might resign. There's all sorts of people who are former ABC journalists who are retired, like Cassidy and co. all these people will come in and defend them to the hilt. And, you know, you would be taking your life in your hands if you tried to rein them in. So effectively, they're allowed to get away with things because they can and because there are no constraints on a protected entity.
I wanted to ask you about the ABC's, following on from that, their social media guidelines, because we've seen David Anderson come out after a fair few scandals involving Twitter, that a staff member is responsible for what they write on social media in a legal sense. But that did not apply to Louise Milligan, who made some defamatory comments about former MP Andrew Laming and ended up being sued. The ABC took liability for her tweets, but has now said that it will no longer be doing that. Is that part of the Untouchables mentality, that thing? And we've seen lately, if you offend people on the left of politics and you're an ABC staffer, like we saw with Fazir Ibrahim, she was suspended off TV for a few weeks for offending Labor types. Is there a double standard here?
Absolutely. They're not interested in being balanced. They just don't seem to have any sense of proportion about all this. Some of those star journalists can get away with whatever they like. And as I say, I think it's very difficult for a managing director. Jonathan Shire probably tried to do something, but, you know, it just didn't work out because everything he said that was critical got reported, and you just despair at the lack of managerial accountability. Back in the old days, you had very long-serving MDs, and they ran the show. Everyone knew that. But when Bill Peach and Co came along, they said, "Oh, we're going to change this. We're going to make it. We'll have the producers in charge of the show, not management, not the board." And they just ran their own race. And if you are like-minded, then you're only going to get one side of every story.
My question is about how we go about actually fixing a lot of the issues around the ABC. In your book, you talk about that we need a government-appointed ABC ombudsman. I know a lot of other people, including the Menzies Research Centre and a lot of MPs, have called for an ombudsman as well. A couple of weeks ago, the board came back and said they would be having a board-appointed ABC ombudsman, which would be supposedly independent. Do you think it's possible for a board-appointed ombudsman of the ABC to actually be independent?
I think it's an oxymoron. You simply can't have a self-appointed ombudsman. The concept of an ombudsman is someone who's independent, arm's length, who can make a valid judgment objectively about an issue. The ABC complaints regime has been, in my view, it's been gravely defective for 30 more years or more. And they always want to control everything. They're managing it. And this will end up with classic capture. They will decide who they appoint so that there's no confidence that they'll appoint anyone really objective. And even when they appoint a committee of inquiry of people who are quite well regarded, they don't accept the results. So it doesn't follow that because an ombudsman who's going to report to the board, it will quietly say there's a bit of a problem here. They'll probably argue against it and he'll go away and change his mind. I mean, I just don't have any confidence that a self-appointed ombudsman, so-called, I think it's a misuse of the term, is going to have any success at all. The ABC should not be allowed to be involved in any decision-making about their quality of recording. And yet they just seem to think it's a God-given right. I mean, that social media stuff, just to get back to it for a moment, the fatal flaw there, the BBC have said, new CEO running the place, said you can't do social media, can't tweet. But no, here, what Anderson says is, well, you've got to make it clear that it's your view, but otherwise you can go for your life. Now, the only reason we would listen to any of these people is they're ABC employees. So it's a nonsense, it's a farce. They're not being held accountable, they're not being constrained, they're not honouring their employment contract, which is to hopefully make the ABC bigger and better. They're just running their own race.
That's right. I think it was Tim Davey, the new Director General, said, if you want to be activists, you can be activists, but not on the BBC dime. I wanted to ask you about the geography of the ABC, which I get a lot of feedback from our subscribers to their ABC about, that the part of that capture you talk about is the fact that they are located in places like South Bank and Ultimo. Do you think it's possible to have the ABC headquarters moved? Do you think that would be beneficial or change the ABC in the way it's run?
Absolutely. The BBC relocated to Manchester some years ago. No one's complained about that. It gives them a fundamentally different view of the world. If you know what the UK is like, the north is working class, broadly speaking, and the south is very gentrified, rather corporate, complete two different worlds. So to have someone living and working and breathing in an area where they don't necessarily have a left-wing view of the world is very healthy. But what the ABC did, Paul Fletcher had been asking them to relocate. And what they did, they came up with another Potemkin sham, which is, we're going to get some of our people to move out to Parramatta, but it won't happen for some years. No reason why it couldn't happen tomorrow, mind you. We'll announce that in due course, and 70% of people will be, our key reporters or something. But when you think about it, Parramatta's only half an hour away from Sydney. So there's no guarantee these people will relocate physically and live in the community. Probably they just drive there and drive home after the day's work. And even Ida Buttrose said things like, what it'll do is enable us to do more reporting about Western Sydney issues. Well, that's not the issue either. The issue is if you are exposed to Middle Australia and you understand their priority issues, you will find that jobs, incomes, families are much more important than all this other left-wing stuff. And yet I don't think anyone in the ABC thinks that driving out to Parramatta is going to change their worldview, because they don't want to change their worldview. And there's no, as we say, there's no accountability. No one's going to punish them for being one-sided. So you do what you can.
I find that the most even-handed, fair reporting comes from those ABC bureaus outside in the regions. The IPA was in the Hunter and in North Queensland just before the election campaign, and you're much more likely to get a even-handed run on the radio in ABC Tropical North or ABC in the Hunter Valley than you are anywhere near Ultimo. In fact, they don't often ask the IPA to come on in from the Ultimo or South Bank studios anymore, but the local radio are definitely keen to hear all perspectives. Because in a sense they have to live and work amongst their community, and the reporters of the talk programs, know what the issues are. I think it would make a hell of a difference if they were to move outside. I would love to see them at the new Western Sydney Airport, Aerotropolis. I think that would be a great place to put them, but somehow I don't think that'll happen. And we talk about reform. We've just come out of 9 years of coalition government, and it gets said a lot to me that people don't feel like much was done to combat the ABC, despite the ABC's hostility against the coalition government. Do you think the last 9 years have been a missed opportunity?
Look, there are things you can do, but there are also things you can say. And if the reality is that you're never going to get serious change through the Senate, for obvious reasons, Labor, Greens, on principle, oppose everything. Might be different in government. But what that means is you've got to have a crack. You've got to spell out why you have a problem. And I don't know that even from the Prime Minister down, they really ever wanted to get into a fight with the ABC. And that is just throwing in the towel for me. You should be out there. Everyone else, these independent committees of inquiry, into the Neville Rand problem with Luna Park and things. I don't know the government ever said much about any of that. There are two ways you approach legislation. If you can't get it through the Senate, you can either just say, well, we won't bother, or you can argue your case. And unless you argue your case, people don't really think you're serious about it. I think unfair dismissals was an article of faith for us, and we put that up into the Senate at least 35 times in my era. So I don't think they really took the ABC on in the way that they should have. Just to get back to your other point about the regions, I think you'll find that their representation in even other lesser capital cities than Melbourne, Sydney is quite diminished from what it used to be. I don't know, they're even in Tasmania or Adelaide anymore. They might be nominally. But I can go back to my time almost 30 years ago and I found exactly what you're now saying, that you go out there and you get a very fair, open-minded discussion. And it's because they reflect the views of their own communities. And yet the ABC was, we don't have any problems. No, our people are very happy with the ABC. Well, they probably are happy in the regions because they're getting what they want. They certainly aren't getting it in the city. And the idea that somehow you can completely ignore half the population and get away with it is extraordinary. Now, imagine a company doing that, saying we're not selling to women or something. You just can't do that unless you have this huge moat of protection around you.
How did you go about, and I'm sure our viewers would love to hear about this, how did you go about creating some accountability when you were the minister? And is there anything you would have done differently?
Well, I suppose my last throw of the dice was reporting them for their coverage of the Iraq War, basically on AM. And I put in, I think it was 68 complaints. The ABC, under the prevailing regime, had a complaints manager. He dismissed all but 2, and he was scathing about the rest. What a disgrace, blah, blah, blah. So I then appealed to various levels, and the ABC itself referred it to a self-appointed committee, which they no doubt assumed would be helpful, but it wasn't at all. So what we ended up with was a finding of more faults than there were days in the Iraq War. In other words, at least one a day they were in breach. They were either biased or, not complying with the requirements. And yet nothing happened after that. They never apologised, they never explained, they never wanted to debate it. Well, in fact, a couple of years later, they pretended that they'd got a clean bill of health out of it. I mean, it was just beyond belief. So you are constrained in what you can do as a minister, but I think, what Teddy Roosevelt called the bully pulpit doesn't just apply in election times. You can call people out. And unless you do that, they feel that, they can get away with things. You're not game to take them on. And yet politics is really about engaging in issues. Even if you know you probably won't win in one sense, you can win the argument. In fact, I've always said provoking a controversy is very important. If you look at what Trump did, he did it as a deliberate strategy. I mean, he went over the top and he was rude and crude and offensive and all the rest, but he took them on. I mean, he called the media out. I'm not going on CNN, you're biased, And people loved this. The media hated it, of course, but it made people focus on what was the real issue that he was on about. And I think the same here. You've got to have a bit of controversy, and if they want to push back, that's fine. We'll argue the case.
Yeah, there certainly, I guess, wasn't a lack of trying to have a discussion. I can recall early in the Abbott government when the Q&A program invited a convicted terrorist, allegedly, onto the Q&A program. Tony Abbott was furious about that and went out the next day and said that Australians would be ashamed of the ABC for the decision that made and that they weren't on Australia's side. There's been other examples where the government did push back, particularly on Triple J changing the date of their Australia Day Hottest 100 to acknowledging that it was Invasion Day, using Invasion Day and Australia Day interchangeably. What do you think about the ABC engaging in those big cultural issues and going out on a limb to be very political?
Well, I think they got badly burnt over Invasion Day, and even the Q&A, Tony Jones and co. never ever took a backward step. In fact, they flaunted their unimpartiality. But you've got to engage with them, and at least, the Murdoch press is prepared to report these failings. You never get it much in the other side, the left media as it's now called. But that's what politics is all about. It's doing and saying. And unless you hold them to account, people won't ever understand why you're so concerned. And to me, it's going to be harder to change the charter. It's going to be harder to get legislation through. How do you get rid of a staff-appointed director? How do you appoint a chairman who's going to really engage properly? These are very difficult, and we've shown time and again you can appoint people to the board, but it makes no difference. So you've got to call them out. That's the best thing you can do in politics.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for this discussion. It's been really insightful. If our viewers want to get a copy of Their ABC, Australia's largest sheltered workshop, we'll add some links in the podcast description and on the social media videos as well. But thank you so much for joining us, Richard.
Connor Court's where you go to get the book.
Excellent. We'll add the Connor Court website in as well. Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Evan.